Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this IGP Across the Aisle discussion. I'm Claire Shipman, co-chair of the Board of Columbia, and more importantly, a SIPA alum. And I'm so thrilled to see all of my fellow alums in the audience tonight. I want to quickly introduce our panelists because we have a little bit of a hard out tonight, and we have a lot to get through. I'm not going to read their whole bios, which you can find under the programs, but Paul Dabbar, we are thrilled that you are here. He served in the first Trump administration as the Department of Energy's Undersecretary for Science. More importantly, he's been with us at Columbia, I think, right? He's been a non-resident fellow and a former distinguished visiting fellow at CGEP. Jason Bordoff is the founding director of CGEP, as well as a professor of professional practice at SIPA. He served in the Obama administration on climate and energy issues. He's also the co-founding dean of our Columbia Climate School. Thank you both, gentlemen, for being with us. Big picture, Paul, I want to start with you. You worked closely with this transition team shaping the Department of Energy priorities now, and we've heard a lot about just really the phrase energy dominance. That's very important to this administration. But what would you say that means in practice? It's more than just drill, baby, drill, right? It's a broader array of priorities.
Yeah, so, the president talked a lot in his months of speeches, hour after hour. And it's actually quite easy to see his energy policy if you scrape his speeches. There's about 12 or 13 points that come up over and over again. And the top two are the energy dominance, unleashing American energy is a little bit more of a term that he's been using, and the energy inflation point. So those are the top two out of the 12 or so. But I think at the macro point, like what does unleashing American energy dominance mean, is that there's kind of four major policy points for energy that are brought up on a kind of a normal basis. Energy production or availability, energy prices, environmental impact, and national security. Those are the four that people kind of bring up on a regular basis. The last administration did a very high focus on item 3. And even within environmental impact, I ran the largest environmental cleanup program in the United States by far as undersecretary. It's a narrow focus on carbon. There's plenty of other environmental topics besides carbon. And so the president's focus is, I want to focus on all four in a balanced way. We need to produce more energy. We need to have, we need to bring down prices, environmental impact, and national security. And the last thing I would say on that is that he remembers during his first administration, the energy production went up significantly. We had energy deflation. Prices were dropping during that whole time frame. The U.S. did lead the world in reduction of emissions. You can argue whether it should have gone faster or not, but it was actually at the same rate as Obama and the same rate as Biden. So that's the facts. And the national security was much better in the Middle East and elsewhere as a result of that. So that's his mindset.
Jason, you can give us a slightly different viewpoint because you just were at Davos. How would you describe what world leaders, global CEOs are thinking about the executive orders they're seeing, policy signals coming from Washington, and also what they may be seeing as a shift in U.S. energy policy?
Thanks. Thanks, Claire, for being here, and just what a privilege it is to be in this room and celebrate SIPA and see so many friends here, including remarkable leaders in energy and the environment. I saw Jen Morris, who leads the Nature Conservancy here, a SIPA grad, and I'm on the trustee there in New York. And saw Dan Propp, who was my student and then my teaching assistant, and then worked for me after he graduated until he left to go work at the Energy Bureau at the U.S. Department of State, which was created by Secretary Hillary Clinton. So it's a big energy policy circle of life at SIPA, where we train people and then they go off to serve in those important policy positions. Look, what we heard overseas, not just in Switzerland in January, but generally, is a lot of uncertainty And I think that's part of our job at a place like SIPA, or the Center on Global Energy Policy, is trying to be sources of sober-minded analysis to help people understand what's going on, what matters and what doesn't. So everyone's seeing headlines that we're unleashing dominance, that we're opening the offshore to drilling, we're unleashing LNG exports, we're pulling out of the Paris Agreement, and the questions are, what does it mean that U.S. oil production is going to surge, which is going to be determined by oil prices far more than whether you're allowed to drill off the coast of Virginia, even if one allows you to, or pulling out of Paris, which generates a lot of headlines. Probably doesn't matter, not that I would have done it, as much as the headlines suggest. I think that what's always fascinated me about energy, and how great is it that we can talk about, like, we have 3 panels, there's so much to talk about in the world, and one of them is on energy. How exciting is that? I couldn't figure out what I was interested in, and so I was interested in international economics and foreign policy and science and care about the environment. Energy just brings all of those together. You can't make good energy policy decisions without understanding the dimensions of these decisions on each of those. And so I was interviewing on my podcast, one of Paul's former colleagues, Frank Fannin, who led the Energy Bureau at the State Department that Secretary Clinton created in the Trump administration. And his point, and I think was right, which is that among all those sometimes competing policy priorities, for the Biden administration, climate was the North Star. And for this one, energy security and affordability will be the North Star. And sometimes that takes you to the same place, sometimes it doesn't. But the only comment I would make is that this is not unique to the Trump administration. So you talk to leaders in Europe who the first thing they want to talk about is energy affordability and competitiveness and Mario Draghi's report. You look at Mark Carney running in Canada, walking back support for a carbon tax, or European Union, which just said they were going to exempt most companies, European companies, from their carbon border adjustment, not to mention emerging and developing economies that struggle to have access to any energy at all. So there's a risk here, which is we forget about the importance of climate, which I hope we don't do. But there's an opportunity too, because I've been writing for years and believe that if we don't guarantee energy security and access and affordability, the first thing that's going to go is support for a stronger climate agenda. And we have to figure out how to solve all of these sometimes competing policy priorities simultaneously. And this might be a moment of reset that allows us to focus on all the goals of energy policy and try to make progress on all of them.
Well, Paul, taking Jason's point that many other countries may be looking at things in a similar way. How do you think though about this administration's focus on energy, a change in policy, and international dynamics? What are the implications, for example, with our competitive relationship with China, and for our friends, Canada and Mexico? And let me just throw tariffs, which we've heard a lot about tonight, on top of that. How do you think all of that is going to affect how will our energy policy affect those relationships, and then how does all of that work together?
So I wrote a paper about this at Hoover and stepped through the implications of American leadership on energy, how that changed, why that changed, and the impact of that on the global diplomacy. So the energy posture of the United States is radically different than where it was 8 years ago. The U.S. is now the #1 producer of natural gas in the world. It's the #1 exporter of natural gas in the world. It's the #1 producer of crude oil in the world. Let's absorb that. I think most people in this town don't realize this kind of basic facts. And the U.S. is the #3 exporter of crude in the world. It is also by far the biggest developer of new energy technologies. And as was mentioned by the gentleman from NASDAQ, we dominate the world in capital raising. We just completely swamp the world. And so America's leadership in energy creates a very different diplomatic space than 8 years ago. And that strength can be used in a very positive way. So I'll give you an example, which gives more flexibility. It's a very narrow point. It's a very diplomatic point. When President Trump decided to move the embassy to Jerusalem in his last administration, they sat around the Situation Room have debated the reaction in the Middle East of the U.S. moving the embassy to Jerusalem. And they were going around the table and talking about things. And my boss, the energy secretary, raised his hand and said, you know what, one thing we're not talking about is OPEC putting 1973 style embargo on us because we're supporting Israel, because we now are the largest energy producer in the world. So, and one last other thing, I wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal, which is in 2020, OPEC invited us to join OPEC. Just absorb that. We were asked to join OPEC Plus to be part of the cartel because of our leadership in oil production. We said no. It was a very entertaining series of phone calls that we got from various countries.
Before OPEC, the cartel was us. It was the Texas
Yeah,
Railroad
we were the OPEC before '73. So our impact in the world is just really very, very different. How we can interact, given the physical technology production footprint change.
Do you think that, I mean, specifically on tariffs, too early to tell what impact that will have, either of you? Jason?
Well, I mean, we can, I think it's too early to tell because it's a little hard to tell how much of these are threats to extract concessions, how much will go into effect. But I think the thing I would say is it's all in a continued acceleration of a trend that had been underway for a while, which was a trend of geoeconomic fragmentation, of rising protectionism. We saw Biden continue and in some cases increase tariffs that the Trump administration had put in place. And this is driven by a sense of concern. Like, energy matters again. That's why I'm glad we're doing this panel. And what I mean by that is, like, we sort of became complacent for a few decades. Like, we developed a collective amnesia after the 1970s because we took energy security for granted. And we were talking, and we should talk, absolutely. I mean, I am proud to have helped create the new Columbia Climate School about climate and sustainability, but along with that, the goals of energy security and affordability. And we've been shaken from that complacency in the last few years, partly because of the energy crisis that Europe went through, partly because of what we're seeing around the world with price impacts today, the struggle that developing countries have to access the energy that they need, and because of this new world of great power competition we're in, and viewing China in many respects as an adversary. And so trying to make sure that we're diversifying supply chains, that we're not too dependent. I think what we need there, it's again part of the role of a place like SIPA, or the Center on Global Energy Policy, is rigorous critical thinking to really figure out what matters and what doesn't, so everything doesn't sort of become lumped together. Like, depending on one country to import the daily flow of energy you need, like oil, is simply not the same thing as depending on one country for manufactured products that you install to generate electricity, like a solar panel. The risks of disruption in the supply chain are different. And when we talk about a small yard and a high fence, and then you see multiple competing policy priorities like winning the state of Michigan and creating jobs in the United States and national security, and these all get talked about in one way, and then we lump all of energy together. And the truth is, if you're highly dependent on China for 90% of your advanced semiconductors with sensitive military applications, that's probably a risk. If you're heavily dependent on China for a manufactured product like a solar panel, it's not as obvious that's a risk. And then something like an electric vehicle and a battery might be somewhere in the middle. I just think we have to have a more nuanced conversation about what problem we're trying to solve, what the actual risks are, how to de-risk, which doesn't mean make everything at home and disconnect yourself from the global economy, and then recognize that I think we're not taking seriously enough the tension between these goals. If you want a faster energy transition, you need clean energy to be cheaper, not more expensive. And the scale and magnitude of the growth we need, the supply chains are so monumental. The idea that with some tariffs on China and some IRA subsidies and some friendshoring, we can replicate this and dramatically reduce China's footprint in any meaningful time frame is unlikely to happen. And so we have to grapple with the tension between those two things more than we are.
Do you, and I appreciate, I think the two of you agree on a lot. So even though it's nice to see across the aisle agreement, don't get me wrong. Two questions. One, what do you see as if not between the two of you, points of contention on the horizon here at home? For example, the public policymakers in terms of this administration's energy policy, and were all the tech titans at the inauguration, are they sort of all on board with this energy directive? I mean, can we expect any tension?
Yeah, I don't want to speak for Paul. I mean, but we just, for those who want more of us, I just spent an hour talking with Paul on my podcast, which is a weekly conversation with an energy leader. And I think one of the areas where I don't know if it was your view, but you were trying to articulate the view of the incoming administration when you talk about, is climate a priority or not? Like, how do we think about it in the context of these other priorities? And I think the view is, we saw emissions go down the last Trump administration. Clean energy is progressing. And I guess what I would say is, over the last decade or so, I think the evidence shows we did reduce emissions in the US. A big part of that was cheap gas replacing coal. That doesn't continue in perpetuity. Like, if you want to solve an environmental problem, it's unlikely that the market alone is going to figure this out just because it turns out that clean energy is the cheapest way to produce it. We have a negative externality. We're emitting pollution, and the role of government is to correct that market failure, and we need stronger climate policy in order to do that. I think one area of agreement is, I'm usually pretty pessimistic, glass half empty, but there is a part of me that sees an opportunity to make progress on all of these things, because one of the things I found striking about the emergency order, President Trump declared a national energy emergency. And you might wonder why that is the case when we have pretty cheap gas. Energy prices are 4 times in Europe what they are here, not to mention parts of the world that are struggling to afford any energy at all. A big part of that wasn't about drill, baby, drill. It was about electricity and the power sector, modernizing our grid. How do we compete for leadership with China, particularly in the area of AI? And we know AI takes a lot of electricity. There's a big opportunity there to find common ground, in my view, on permitting reform, to make it easier to build infrastructure, on nuclear, which we absolutely need for energy security and decarbonization, carbon capture and removal technology, a set of tools in the toolkit that, frankly, the left hasn't always acknowledged the importance of as much as perhaps we should, in addition to solar and wind. And the pendulum's going to swing back. Given what is in store for us from the impacts of climate change, we can't be this complacent a decade or two from now. So the pendulum will swing back, I hope. There will be an urgency to addressing that a bit more than today. And it is possible that we'll have a stronger set of tools in the toolkit to do that, because we're going to focus, hopefully, in a way that generates support across the aisle for make it easier to build infrastructure, build a more robust set of tools. Some of that will be natural gas for sure, but some of it's going to be lower carbon technologies that we need to firm up our grid as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll jump on the grenade about the differences. Okay, I'm speaking as someone who helped build 40 to 50,000 megs of wind and solar over my life, including currently at a company I'm on the board of. And I traded electricity. Wind and solar has certain positives, and there's certain negatives. And I think one of the kind of differing points is that some people have thought that wind and solar is like the be-all and end-all. Mm-hmm. It doesn't come close, okay, in terms of anyone who, if you trade electricity, about it being available. And lithium-ion batteries don't solve it. We won the Nobel Prize, okay, for lithium-ion when I was undersecretary. It was kind of my day job of funding technologies. It was a wonderful day, and it was a great American invention. It's too expensive to be base load required for at night. It only runs for 4 hours. That doesn't really, and at the cost, doesn't really work. Mm-hmm. So we need to develop new technologies. And I think the focus area around, rather than building old technologies, is that the way we solve our problems is that we still need to invent the future. So we're just announced the first fusion plant. You heard me correct. Fusion plant, right? And it's probably going to take 10 years, but it might actually get done. And we're going to start making electricity from hydrogen like the sun. And so that's an example of something which is better than wind and solar if we can get there. So I think whether we use as current and whether is efficacious versus what do we actually need to build to accomplish what we need to. I think that's kind of a difference sometimes that you hear in the debate, and clearly you're hearing from my voice that seizing the horizon, right, and inventing the future. I was Undersecretary for Science running Los Alamos. I mean, it's kind of my book, but I think that's a difference that you'll see in policy.
What, can I ask quickly, because we're now negative 11, 12 seconds, so in 30 seconds each, we talked beforehand about nuclear resurgence, and that sounds like that might be on the horizon.
Yeah, that's my home base. I'm a nuclear engineer. I ran a reactor when I was younger. Nuclear works. It's worked for a very long time. It's baseload. The problem with nuclear is that it's very hard to seemingly to build on time and on budget, meaning it's expensive. And that's the biggest problem with nuclear. It's been a big pickup, especially from the tech sector. A number of announcements for new nuclear. Macron in France just announced a new nuclear deal with AI, new development in France. So it's certainly seeing, a great light in today's environment, but it is really important for the people who are building it to try to be on time and on budget.
Yeah, we need it for energy security, affordability, for modernizing and stabilizing our grid. We absolutely need it for achieving our climate goals, and we need permitting reform. We need to advance the technology, but the new factor we have is AI and these hyperscalers and massive companies with enormous amounts of money to spend who care about their green credentials and are looking for power. Now, this isn't going to happen overnight, but the fact that they're putting real money into it, bringing forward in time both existing and advanced nuclear technology, I think is reason for some optimism.
Thank you, Paul and Jason, and we're so grateful for this across the aisle conversation. We're going to have so many more of these at SIPA, and thank you, everyone.